Hello, everyone. I'm so glad that you came to check out one of our latest recordings. My name is Kelly Greenlee. I'm the Community Outreach Librarian at Prince Memorial Library. The presentation that you are about to see was recorded at an in-person learning event at the library on April 25th, 2023. The presenter is Erin Parker, owner of Edgewood Nursery in Falmouth, Maine. This presentation is part of a year-long initiative that the library is offering in partnership with Chebeague and Cumberland Land Trust and with the Town of Cumberland's Sustainability Committee, which is a subcommittee of the town's Lands and Conservation Committee. I want to stress that we would not be able to offer this extensive and, we think, stellar lineup of offerings without the funding support that was acquired through a grant that was awarded to the Sustainability Committee. Through that grant, they are generously providing the funding to make this and the whole series available to you and others in our community. If you'd like to know more about the Lawns Gone Wild series, you can find the upcoming lineup on the Prince Memorial Library website at princememorial.org. Now, without further ado, I'll move through time and space and drop you into the beginning of Erin Parker's presentation.
Thank you. All right, so I'll put this screen back up at the end if anybody missed it now and wants to, get that information. So just a little bit about the purpose and goals of this presentation. I'm going to be covering a lot of really basic stuff you might already be familiar with, like, oh, you should water your plants. But what I'm trying to do with this presentation is give a really good baseline and also a deeper understanding of some of these really basic core ideas, and also try to move away from several ideas that I think are not founded in reality. So there's a lot of conventional wisdom out there that I have found to be just wrong. So an example of that is people say, like, oh, you can't mulch with leaves because tree leaves will make your soil too acid. And I've been mulching heavily with leaves for 15 years, and my soil has not turned to acid. My soil has gotten better every year with inputs of basically just leaves. So there's a lot of misinformation out there, and the more I learn about the totality of the ecology of gardening, I'll say, the more some of the practices that have worked really well for me get sort of tied together and make more sense. It's like, oh, well, I've been doing this for a while anyway, and now that I learned an extra piece of information, I understand why it works. So I'm trying to give you sort of that baseline. And we'll start it off with what plants need to grow. Pretty basic stuff. Plants need sunlight for photosynthesis. Almost all plants need that. There's a few non-photosynthetic plants. We'll get too off track by going into those. Plants need water, also for photosynthesis, and then soil. And the soil is a big thing that you will be paying a lot of attention to as a gardener. So it's not just that there's soil, it's that the soil is alive. And not only should the soil be alive, but the soil is a self-organizing community of organisms. And if there are any major roles missing from that community, the self-regulation of that system tends to break down and not work so well. And one way to understand this is the soil food web, which is a phrase that was, I believe, coined by Dr. Elaine Ingham. And if you want to learn oodles and oodles about this, you can look up Elaine Ingham on YouTube, or if you prefer audio medium, search podcast episodes for Elaine Ingham. She's got lots of interviews out there where she kind of sums up these ideas in about an hour. But to kind of walk you through the idea of the soil food web, almost all the energy on Earth comes from the sun. It's generally on terrestrial ecosystems, so on land that's captured by plants. The plants turn it into sugar and then build themselves out of it, and the energy kind of flows through the ecosystem. And that's an idea that's kind of been around for a long time. A lot of people are familiar with this. An idea that is fairly recently kind of getting out into mainstream consciousness is that plants give sugar directly to a lot of microorganisms. So plants, their greatest asset is the ability to photosynthesize and make these simple sugars. But in a lot of situations, the plant is not using the majority of that sugar to run its cellular functions and produce more plant. Often more than half of the sugar that a plant creates through photosynthesis is put directly into the soil through something called root exudates. And the reason the plants do that is to feed the microorganisms, mostly the fungi and bacteria, here, that are the majority of the living mass of the soil. And those fungi and bacteria are able to mobilize water and mineral nutrients in the soil that are then brought to the plant. A lot of people are familiar with the idea of mycorrhizal fungi, but these are fungi that live in obligate symbiosis with plants. That means they cannot exist without a living plant. And they form networks that interconnect whole communities of plants. And they are able to move nutrients and water from significant distances through that mycorrhizal network to feed and water plants. And connection to a network of mycorrhizal fungi increases plants' access to water and nutrients by roughly a factor of 10. So that's extremely significant. And because of that, about 90 to 95% of plants on Earth form these connections with mycorrhizal fungi. So if you think about having this connection between plants and living soil being 90% of the water and nutrient uptake capacity of the plant, that becomes extremely important. And not messing that up becomes a very important aspect of gardening. It's obviously there's a lot of other players in this food web, and they all are important because the exchange between plants, fungi, and bacteria kind of doesn't work if you don't also have protozoa, nematodes, and arthropods in there, because the sort of old way of looking at plant nutrition is that plants simply absorb soluble nutrients out of the soil like a sponge. Everyone's familiar with this idea. If there's not, any nitrogen in the soil, then the plant, can't grow because there's no nitrogen. And that's the way that hydroponics work. And that's to some degree how industrial agriculture works. But anything resembling an ecosystem, anything resembling a sane system, there isn't just nutrients floating around free. That's very, very unusual in the world we live in. Those nutrients immediately get gobbled up by something. So in a healthy soil or in any sort of naturalistic ecosystem, all the nutrients are inside of something that's alive. And while the bacteria do respond to the exudates of the plants, that sugar that they're being fed to mobilize nutrients, in most cases, they're not just like, okay, here you go, plant, here's the nutrients that you need. You need to have the bacteria there that is able to mobilize the nutrient, and then that bacteria needs to get eaten by something. And it's actually the waste of the bacteria or the waste of the thing that ate the bacteria becomes the fertilizer for the plant. So you can think of it as like micro manure. That's happening in this minuscule ecosystem that exists, in the smallest drop of water in the soil. A teaspoon of soil has, I forget how much, but it's a huge amount of bacteria and fungal cells, and hopefully nematodes and arthropods and all those other players in the soil food web. So there's a lot to think about here, but you don't need to get too far into it because, like I said, this system is largely self-regulating. Where that self-regulation breaks down is if it's disturbed too much or poisoned, or if basically bad things happen and suddenly you don't have any protozoa because they all got killed, or your fungal population gets heavily disrupted. It gets out of balance, it doesn't work so well. So as long as we do our best to sort of nurture, support, and most importantly, not screw up this soil food web, that's, like I said, 90% of what it takes to keep plants in the garden healthy. And the things that we can do to not screw up an existing soil community are first eliminating or reducing poisons. So pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, all kill these living organisms in the soil. So obviously poisoning them to death is not good. That's a bad disruption. Soil disturbance, tilling, disrupts these communities significantly. Bacteria bounce back from tilling quite rapidly because they're just tiny single cells, and they can withstand a significant amount of tillage. But because fungal networks are these long, spread out networks that can connect over hundreds of yards, when you chop that all into little pieces, that damages it. And some of the protozoa and nematodes are also pretty sensitive to tillage. So minimizing the use of tillage in your gardening activities helps a lot. So if you can, if you're making a new garden, maybe you need to till it once to get it established. Maybe you don't. Maybe you can use a technique called sheet mulching that I'll talk about in a minute. But anytime that you can avoid a tillage event, you're saving your soil biology and therefore saving yourself 90% of the nutrients and water that you might otherwise have to provide for that system. So going back to here, we can talk about water for a minute. Water is thankfully pretty abundant in the place where we live, but it's become a lot less reliable. I remember 15, 20 years ago, we used to have more consistent spring and summer rains, especially spring. And we're now getting, basically mini drought events in a lot of springs. So even though it might be nice to, not have to water, having some ability to keep soil damp when you need it damp is pretty important to a successful garden. And watering schedule is something that also conventional wisdom doesn't always work out super well. So daily watering should not be necessary for most gardening applications. There are exceptions, like if you're trying to get carrot seeds to germinate, you'll probably have to water daily. But generally speaking, one deep watering per week is all that most gardens need. And that supports deep rooting of plants. And you're kind of setting up a virtuous cycle where if you water deeply, your plants will set deeper roots and be able to pick up more water, meaning you have to water less often. What is caused by frequent shallow waterings is the water is only going to penetrate, an inch. And so the plants will mostly set roots there. That's also where weed seeds are. So if you're watering, 3 or more times a week, you're going to increase the growth of weeds and decrease the growth of crop plants and landscape plants and stuff like that. So infrequent watering, but deeply watering is where it's at. And obviously, if it rains, you can skip it. And I have yet to figure this out from any sort of scientific lens, but rain is just so much better than any kind of irrigation. I don't know why. Irrigation will absolutely keep plants alive, but when you get a nice solid rain, everything just looks so much better and it just grows so much better. I don't know why. It might just be that it's, more even and gentle and consistent than it's possible to irrigate, but that rain is really nice. One more connection between water and the soil food web. Who here has ever had a potted plant that dried out 100%, got bone dry, and then you try and water it and it just will not get damp again? Common experience. Part of that has to do with just the hydrophobic aspect of peat moss. Like when it gets really dry, it just takes a little bit to get rehydrated. But there's also that happens in soil as well. And a lot of it has to do with bacteria that are in the soil. And bacteria need water to stay alive, as do most living things. And so when times get tough for bacteria and their environment is drying out, they need to do something to stay alive. And lots of species of bacteria will go dormant and they will seal themselves in a hydrophobic coating that seals the water into their cells so they don't dehydrate and die. Consequently, your soil is now very hydrophobic and it takes a lot of, a huge amount of water to get it going again. So you want to avoid ever getting to that point of bone dry soil because it's really hard to come back from that. So you don't need to be watering all the time, constantly inputting water, but at the same time, you want to avoid the soil ever getting to dusty dry. And we'll talk about mulch in a few minutes, and that's a great way to help maintain that. And also just, kind of monitoring. So you can see visually what soil looks like when it's dry. You can feel it with your fingers. And if you're like, oh, should I water today? Scraping back, a 1/16 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch of soil just to see if it's, is the soil really starting to dry out, in which case you want to water, or it's like, oh, well, it's dry just on the very surface and then it's damp below that. Maybe wait another day or two. Okay, so another aspect of this presentation is I could probably talk to you for about 6 hours trying to give you a solid baseline understanding of many aspects of gardening, but we only have 2 hours. So there's more information in the handout than I can reasonably cover. And I designed this to work with somewhat smaller groups, but I'm going to try and do what I would do with a smaller group. And I'll ask for, can you raise your hand if you would like to hear about choosing a site for a garden? All right, so I'll talk about choosing a site for a garden, but I won't linger on it too much. So when you're choosing a site for a garden, it's good to think about like how long you're going to be there. Like land tenure is a huge thing if you want to grow long-term things like, oh, I would like to grow an apple tree, but I'm a renter and I, don't know where I'll be in 5 years. So that's a big thing that's always good to think about. Sun exposure, very important. If you want a vegetable garden, you want full sun. But if you want a woodland garden, then you want a significant amount of shade. Wind exposure can matter, especially in really open sites. Most plants are going to do better with some amount of windbreak. Water on the site matters. Like if there's a spot that gets it to be a big puddle when it rains, that could be great for some plants, but for a lot of plants, that's going to be a hindrance. What the soil is like, compaction issues. Compaction is one of the problems that you might run into that basically needs a physical intervention of some sort. So avoiding compaction is solved with two things. One is pathways. So rather than walking over the general garden space, having a specific area where you always walk, a path, helps to avoid stepping on the soil, because one of the things that's not on the slide is air. Soil needs to breathe, and it breathes through little micro passageways in the soil. When you step on them, those passageways tend to get smushed out. If you run a machine over that soil, like a tractor, lawnmower, anything like that, a vehicle, that really smashes it down. And if someone else did that, even if it was 10 years ago, you might have soil compaction issues, especially if you have a clay-like soil. Figuring out whether you have compaction issues is usually as simple as digging a hole. So if you can easily stick a spade into the ground and pull it out and the soil's like nice and fluffy, probably no compaction issues, at least at that depth. You might have more compaction issues way down in the ground, but that may not be a problem. If you try to stick a spade into the ground and it's like digging through concrete, that soil is probably pretty well compacted and you should do something to break it up. So especially when siting a new garden or renovating a garden that's not doing so well, remedying compaction is pretty important. My favorite tool, and I almost brought it, but it's a very large tool, so I didn't, is a broad fork for this. And a broad fork, you might be familiar with a spading fork or garden fork that's about this wide, usually has a short D handle. A broad fork is about this wide, and the tines are frequently like 12 to 16 inches long. You use it by sticking it into the ground and standing on it, rocking it back and forth. And then you step back off of it and you use your whole body weight to pull it back. And you can lift a piece of soil about this big. And it just breaks up the compaction a little bit, but without disturbing the soil so much that you kill all these guys. It just lets a little bit of space into the soil for light and air to move. And by broad forking, you can often greatly increase the depth of your soil. So a lot of soils have, a really nice topsoil layer like this. And then there's some compaction layer underneath that. And if you can break up that compaction, double your amount of available soil depth, then you double the amount of space for the soil organisms to live and for roots to live, and potentially double the amount of water, nutrients that are available.
So you're not turning the soil over, you're
just lightly loosening it up. Yeah, and just very gently. Yes. Great question. Nowhere. Yeah. So they're also pretty expensive. I believe they have them at the main tool library, which, like, a broad fork is not a tool you use every day. I don't use it every day. And this is what I do for a living. But like, I own one because this is my livelihood. Getting together with a few friends and buying one, they're like $250. That's totally reasonable. Check with the main tool library. I think that's like $50 a year, and they have all sorts of great tools that you can borrow. Public libraries occasionally have them. It would be awesome if the Prince Memorial Library bought one.
So that is something that we're considering here at the library. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, please let us know. Space, of course, is an issue for us. So anything that we purchase, tools have to be smallish. But a broad fork is definitely on the high on the list.
Excellent. Yeah.
We're trying to start a community orchard, so if we can get that started, we'll have a shed at the community orchard, and we'll have a broad fork.
Yeah.
I also have one to be friends with me.
So, you know, I highly recommend, if you're thinking about buying one or buying one with some friends or whatever, highly recommend the brand Meadow Creature, because it's a very heavy duty tool that's going to last through whatever abuse you send at it. Whereas there's broad forks that are made and sold by Johnny's Selected Seeds that are and would not be appropriate for a community use, because with everybody using it, it's going to break. Whereas a Meadow Creature, you could like try and lift a boulder out of the ground with it and probably be fine. Yeah. So good quality broad fork, great like community or friend group investment, or, you know, if you're going to use it a lot, a personal investment, but a really amazing tool. Yes.
Just come with teenagers to run it.
Oh, that would be amazing. No, you supply supply your own teenagers, but it's a great full body workout. Like, it really gets every part of your body. Or if you're not up for that, yeah, hire some local teen. Okay, other siting issues. Is lead contamination an issue? Less of an issue here in Cumberland, but certainly worth checking on. If you live in a previously industrial area, or an area that has burned down 6 or 7 times, like Portland, there's probably lead in the soil. And if you are gardening for food production, that's a really important thing to know. If you think there's any reasonable chance of lead contamination in your soil, that's a great reason to do a soil test. Simple soil test costs about $25 through University of Maine, and they'll tell you if there's lead contamination, and if there is, how much. Lead contamination is not a deal breaker, but you usually want to grow, either grow only things that are fruit. So, you know, it could be tree fruit like apples, or fruit on small perennials like raspberries or strawberries. Tomatoes even are fruit, but not so much like leafy greens if you're growing in lead contaminated soil. Or you can have raised beds with a weed mat on the bottom to minimize the roots' interaction with the soil that's contaminated with lead and bring in outside soil. Obviously, you want your garden space to be pleasant and convenient to visit on a daily basis. So if your really good spot where it's full sun is like a 10-minute walk away, it's not terrible, but I would sacrifice some sun or whatever to have it be like right outside your door, somewhere where you're actually going to remember to go check on it every single day. And then, is the space easily accessible for bringing materials in and harvests out? Again, like if that perfect spot with full sun is like, you know, over a brook or something where it's really hard to get materials there, that's going to be an issue, especially with bulky materials like mulch and stuff like that. Another important consideration is what you want to grow. This is just a collage of some garden pictures. This presentation is mostly focused at like vegetable gardening, but certainly applies to like landscape gardening for aesthetics. And also I'm trying to encourage people, like I talked about in my last presentation, to garden for habitat. We all live in a habitat, whether you like it or not, you are part of this environment that we all share. And our gardening is having an increasing amount of effect on our local ecology, just because human managed landscapes are taking up a greater and greater percentage of the wider landscape. So if we can manage our landscape in such a way that it is good habitat for all the other living creatures that live here with us, that's going to make the world a more pleasant place for everyone. So a few things to consider when you're thinking about growing a food garden. What do you already like to eat? There are so many plants that are like the easiest thing to grow. Turkish rocket comes to mind. But if you don't enjoy eating like spicy brassica stuff, then Turkish rocket is not a suitable plant for you to grow. That said, it's good to like try new things and whatever, but if you're starting out like, oh, what I'd like to grow some vegetables, what do I want to grow? Starting out with, you know, making your short list of what do I want to eat out of this garden is the place to start. Another thing to consider is what would you like to try but cannot purchase locally, and or can get a good version of locally. So mulberries come to mind. Mulberries are super easy to grow, really easy and fun, and you can't just go to the store and buy a decent mulberry. Whereas like apples, difficult to grow comparatively, and you can actually go and buy a decent apple. So, you know, keep that in mind. It's like, oh, I can grow mulberries real easy, but they're hard to find in the marketplace. Same with Shazam, another really highly flavored, easy to grow fruit that is, you know, impossible to buy. Time is another factor, obviously. Some annuals especially have a really quick turnaround, like baby greens are like a couple weeks, radishes are like 30 days. If you want an apple tree, it's like at least 3 years. So having a mix of longer term plantings and shorter term plantings makes a lot of sense. If you want to grow food to store for the winter, that is something that you should start planning in the winter before, basically, with selecting crops like winter squash and root crops, stuff like that, so that you can get them in on time and grow them, because a lot of those storage crops have a long growing season. And then also having plans for how to store that. Like if your squash grows really well, where you're going to put 100 pounds of squash, an important planning factor. And then another really important consideration is what grows well on your site. For a myriad of factors, there's almost always some stuff that just doesn't grow well in some places. For instance, I have never grown a really good melon. My friend Max, who runs Winslow Farm, is 2 miles away and grows truckloads of melons. And they just refuse to grow at my house. So if you're a beginning gardener or, you know, experimenting with new stuff, it's great to try, you know, a little bit of a whole bunch of stuff. Some people fall into this trap of like, oh, I just keep growing more and more and more. No, once you grow a few things and find the things that work, it's a wise choice usually to double down on what worked. And like, if broccoli just keeps getting eaten by moths or whatever, maybe you don't need to grow broccoli if, the kale did incredible or whatever. And then if you are gardening more for aesthetics or habitat considerations, what will grow easily becomes even more important. And then thinking about what's missing from local ecology. So if you look at your wider landscape and you see like, it's all pine trees, maybe the ecology would really benefit from having, a couple of oak trees in this area. Or, oh, there's like great spring flowers, but there's nothing that blooms in the fall. Maybe I should plant some asters to fill in that ecological niche. And then also what will provide beauty and aesthetic considerations for humans throughout the season. And also what plants just really catch your eye. I think I know for me, a big part of what makes gardening really pleasant and fun is just being excited about it. Like, I am so excited right now to see some plants that I planted last year, popping back up in the spring. And like, there's lots of stuff that I'm like, oh, I really hope this plant blooms this year. I've been watching this spice bush for 5 years and I really want to taste that fruit. So, planting stuff that you personally are excited to see grow makes the large amount of labor that inherently goes into gardening makes that a joy. Because if it's drudgery, you're not going to want to do it, and why would you? So you got to make it fun. All right. Who here is familiar with a technique called sheet mulching? Nice. Some rooms I've seen recently have had about up to 75% of the people are like, oh yeah, I know what that is. But this looks about a third of you are familiar with it, which is great because I can share with you one of my favorite gardening techniques that not only reduces labor by a huge factor, but also preserves soil biology very effectively and creates gardens that are easier to manage in the long term. So sheet mulching is a technique for opening up a new garden space or renovating a garden space that has become kind of overwhelmed with weeds. And the basic idea is that you're using a sheet layer, which is usually either cardboard or several layers of newspaper. These are biodegradable materials that will be there long enough to suppress and smother out weeds and unwanted plant material, and then will biodegrade and turn into soil in a single year. So if, let's say, you want to start a new vegetable garden, that usually requires a significant amount of amendment of the soil. And these are all pictures from Mount Joy Orchard, which is a free-to-pick community orchard in Portland that I help manage. And you can't see it because it's tiny, but there's a little baby tree there. And now that tree is about 20 feet tall because these pictures were taken about 8 years ago. And that tree was just growing in, a field of grass, and we wanted to not only improve the soil around the tree, but have pathways with access to the trees and companion planting gardens around the trees. So the first thing we did is put down compost. You can see there are gaps in the compost. That's where a path is going, because the path, we want it to be delineated from the growing area, and we don't need necessarily to have compost there. So compost and also some old tree leaves go on directly on the ground. And you can also see right here on the edge, that's a broad fork. So we broad forked around the trees the first thing to reduce any possible compaction issues. Then put down compost leaves and maybe some seaweed. It's another view of the same thing. Then we cover all of that in layers of cardboard. So these are appliance boxes. The prep work for the cardboard is removing any plastic tape or plastic labels because you don't want that in the soil. And then as you're layering it out, you want the edges to overlap. Because if they just kind of touch each other, then whatever plants are growing underneath there will just go underneath and pop up, and it just makes it much less effective. So you want a contiguous sheet. If you use newspaper, people usually take out the shiny like advertisements and stuff because that stuff is coated and the coatings can be kind of gross. You would also want to throw that newspaper in a wheelbarrow or a bucket full of water so it's kind of stuck together. That keeps it from blowing away and makes it easy to have several layers thick of newspaper. So like about 7 layers is enough to smother most plants. I personally like using cardboard. Supposedly, yes. Supposedly, it's like all newspapers are now printed with soy-based inks that don't have any heavy metals in them. And then once you've got your sheet layer on there, you need to cover it with something so it doesn't blow away and doesn't look like a pile of trash. And wood chips are what we used in this case. Wood chips are awesome, especially for perennials and woody plants. For a vegetable garden, I wouldn't necessarily go with wood chips unless they were a really small diameter wood. I would prefer to use for vegetable garden, tree leaves, hay, or straw. And I'll talk more about different types of mulch in a little bit.
It doesn't matter what kind of wood chips they are. I've often heard you should use pine chips in certain places because it's so
It does matter, and it's not so much acidity as I'm sure you're all familiar with turpentine. You know where turpentine comes from? Pine. And when you chip up a pine tree, you can smell that turpentine in there. And there's a lot of volatile chemicals in there that aren't great for soil. So using fresh pine chips is not ideal. It's not the worst thing. If you can let pine sit for 6 months or something in a pile, all that stuff evaporates off. But deciduous chips, I would say, are generally better. And the gold standard is what people call ramial wood chips, which is chipped deciduous wood that's smaller than your fingers, because it has so much bark and cambium. That stuff is like beautiful, but hard to come by. So really, whatever you got around is probably fine. If it's really fresh pine or spruce or whatever, maybe let it sit for a while. Although I totally use fresh pine chips for like a pathway or something like that. Yeah. So next, step. Another thing is if you're mulching around woody plants, you want to be sure that the mulch doesn't touch the bottom of it. Something that drives people like me up the wall is when you see volcano mulching, where the mulch like goes up the tree, and it's like, why? That looks dumb, and it's gonna kill the tree. Trees really don't like that. Trees love having their root zone covered in a thick layer of organic material, but you don't want it to touch the base of the tree. And the reason for that is that roots are adapted to be in the soil, wet all the time. That's great. They're happy with that. The bark of the tree is not. It's supposed to be in the air. And if it gets under the soil, essentially, it can just rot off, and that kills the tree. Here's the same spot 2 years later. All sorts of cool perennials going on in here. The grass is mostly kept out. And this whole space is maintained in 3 hours once a month by volunteers. So very much low maintenance. That said, it's now 8 years later, and we're thinking about re-sheet mulching a whole bunch of these areas. There's still lots of great perennials in there. It's still beautiful, but the grass that's in these mowed paths has, you know, it's been almost 10 years. It's crept into a lot of spots. And luckily we can just do the same thing, cut the grass down, lay down cardboard, wood chips over the top, and come back once a month-ish and pull whatever weeds pop through. Yes.
Do you plant on top of the paper or cardboard down? And then do you plant on top of that? And then
Excellent question. Excellent question. No, you cut through it. And you can plant into a sheet mulched area the same day you do it. It's a little bit fussy to do, but it can be done. Or you can sheet mulch an area, leave it for a while, let all the plants underneath rot, and then it's very easy to plant into. If you do want to plant through a fresh sheet mulch, this brings us to my next tool recommendation. This is a hori-hori, or Japanese soil knife. It's like a cross between a knife and a trowel. And it's a extremely convenient tool for planting through sheet mulch, because you can kind of stab through that cardboard layer, cut out a little, a plug, basically. Usually shake out whatever soil's in there, toss any weeds aside, and then plant whatever you want to plant into that hole, usually with like a little handful of compost to make up for whatever material came out that didn't go back in. One thing that sheet mulch is not particularly suited to is direct seeding right after sheet mulching. Like it's difficult, but not impossible, to sheet mulch a spot and then like sow a row of carrot seeds in it. Sheet mulching also usually gets you a roughly 1 year of weed suppression. So this is a first year sheet mulch with kale and bloody dock and tomatoes and sunflowers. This is also at Mount Joy, and this whole area had virtually no weeds for 1 year. After that, all the cardboard had completely biodegraded, and grass crept in from the edges, and weed seeds blew in from here and there, and it needed, a normal amount of weeding. But also, if you've ever tilled up a garden and not heavily mulched it, you know that brings up what's called the soil seed bank, and you'll frequently just get solid wall-to-wall weeds. Sheet mulching generally avoids that, because whatever weed seeds are already in the soil are just sort of trapped underneath the mulch and don't have proper conditions to germinate. On top of it, nothing. It's just it should be just like wood chips and maybe like an inch. With this technique, we were putting any compost or whatever underneath the sheet layer. You can also do it what I call an upside down sheet mulch. And that would be if you want to, say, direct sow carrots or lettuces or something like that. And in that technique, what you would do is put the sheet layer directly on the ground, and then put a significant layer of finished compost, like 6 inches of finished compost on top of it. And then you've got sort of instant vegetable garden. That works very well. It just is materially intensive. Like, that's a lot of compost. However, if you are doing, just a small vegetable garden or something, that can be a great technique, because, a yard of compost costs $40, and that'll make a decent sized vegetable garden. and that's not, not a huge investment. Okay. Yes.
Difference between laying down one of the plant fiber mats underneath or whatever they're called, textile.
Yep, geotextile.
Yeah, using that instead of, or in addition to, or whatever the cardboard, newspapers and so forth. Basically do the same thing. Or
I really don't like using geotextile for most stuff. What tends to happen with that is soil, like if it's not just fabric on the ground, usually what happens is you have fabric and then mulch layer on top of it. That mulch breaks down, turns into soil, and then you get soil with weeds growing in it, and then the weed roots are going through the geotextile. And it makes them really hard to pull out, and it's just very frustrating to work around. And over time, as that stuff degrades, it's just like microplastics falling into the soil. Yeah, so I try to avoid that as a general rule. The only place where I would advise using geotextile or like plastic weed mat type stuff is if you're trying to isolate a raised bed from contaminated soil. I think that's a good application for it.
is there any canvas type of textiles that don't have the plastic?
Yep, I've seen people use coffee, like burlap coffee bags as part of a sheet mulch, and that works perfectly well. It's such an open texture though that it's less effective than cardboard.
But we don't have an irrigation system.
Mhm.
And when you're talking about deep watering.
Yeah.
For a flower garden, how long is a deep watering? Are you talking an hour, approximately?
Yeah, so what you want is the water to soak into the soil to the depth of the roots, which is usually about 6 inches.
Okay.
So it depends on how focused the water is. So it might be like, if you're watering a new tree, say, and you've made a little berm around it, it might be, it's a 5-gallon bucket in the berm, and that's it once a week. Or if it's like a vegetable garden, it might be half an hour to 45 minutes with like a sprinkler on it, something like that.
So after I finish watering, if I can take a shovel and go down 6 inches and see that it's wet,
Perfect.
then I've done my job.
Exactly. And once you do that a couple times, you'll get a feeling for like, oh yeah, this needs 20 minutes, this needs half an hour, whatever. Also, you mentioned a flower garden. If you're gardening with low maintenance perennial flowers, especially natives that are adapted to this region, you probably don't need to water almost at all. It's like you water them to get established and then they're good to go. And maybe every 5 years there's a really significant drought and you water them once or something. But most of my perennials don't get watered after establishment. Yes.
So I'm back to building this bed. I have some old blue tarps that are dead. They're not using blue tarps anymore. I was thinking about putting them out and weighting them to kill what's there, pulling them back up. I've experienced the geo stuff after a couple of years.
Yeah.
Oh, getting that out some fun.
Yeah.
And there's still pieces popping up like and then I was just thinking about doing wood chips. I got a pretty good source of old wood chips. Could I not do the cardboard at that point? Could I just do wood chips? And can I put some topsoil on top of that?
Let's see. Yeah. So first, blue tarps, especially if they're old, I don't usually recommend because they just disintegrate.
Well, I was gonna before they're not that point yet.
Okay.
But they're at the point where I can't cover up lumber with anymore.
Yeah.
And like, so I would definitely pull them up before they start to fall apart. But I think there's enough left to block the light out to kill the stuff. That's what's gonna happen.
It might take a couple layers because a single layer of blue tarp lets enough light through that it actually kind of forms a little greenhouse.
Oh, yeah.
So they're not terribly effective. but like once you kill the vegetation with something, yeah, you can go ahead and put old wood chips on there. That's great. If you're gonna add topsoil, which you probably don't need to, like the most beautiful soil I've ever seen was from 10 years of wood chip path. Like it made absolutely gorgeous soil after a while. But if you're gonna add topsoil for whatever reason, I would probably put it underneath the wood chips.
Underneath wood chips.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
Oh, and going back to sheet mulching for 1 second, I use this technique for like 90% of new gardens that I build. It's not suitable for all conditions. A few conditions that it's not suitable for: steep slopes. The stuff just runs off. You get a big rain event, and like a lot of, your mulch material will wash away, and it's like not nice to walk on a steep slope. So don't use it on steep slopes. There's a few plants that aren't easily sheet mulched out. Quack grass. It has a very pointy terminal bud on the rhizome, and it just pokes right through the sheet layer. Extremely annoying. And Japanese knotweed is it's possible to sheet mulch out, but very difficult. Another similar technique is something called occlusion, which is where you're covering up the area with a different material that is then removed. And the typical material that's used is a silage tarp, which is a UV stabilized sheet of plastic. Basically, it's usually black on one side, white on the other. It does not let light through. And you can cover an area with a silage tarp, weight it down with a bunch of rocks. You want to do that for the better part of a season. Like now is a great time to set one down. And then you could pull it off in the fall and have just like a totally blank slate. And the silage tarp works better on real tough plants like quackgrass than a cardboard sheet mulch would. Just gonna check time. All right, we're about halfway through. So different ways to get plants started. Direct seeding is the cheapest way. A packet of seeds costs like $1 to $3 and can produce a huge amount of plants. It's also the most annoying way because you're basically starting tiny babies that need a lot of care. Not all seeds take much care, but generally speaking, they need good conditions, like a weed-free seed bed. Here's a bunch of acorns getting planted in my nursery. And it's real hard to grow plants from direct seeded seeds if you've got a lot of weeds going on, because little things pop up, you don't know what to keep, or you can't like use a hoe to save yourself some time. You have to like individually weed. So getting to the point, whether through sheet mulching or a really light tillage or whatever, that you have garden beds that are basically weed free or have low weed pressure, then it makes it much easier to be able to direct seed stuff. Transplants are basically starting from seed in small pots and then bringing the plants out. You could do that on a windowsill. You could do that with lights. If you're working with lights, the simplest thing is to get some of that like industrial shelving, and you can hang lights on the bottom of each shelf and then put a flat of plants right under it. Or if you're just doing a small amount, a south-facing window, you can also buy transplants. I recommend Winslow Farm on Route 100 in Falmouth as a place to buy vegetable seedlings. And you can also grow plants from cuttings. These are elderberry cuttings. There are some plants that just root super easily, like elderberries, willows. and you can just take a section of that stem, stick it in the ground, water it, and up pops a new bush. The same is true of a lot of perennials that can be divided. Classic example is daylilies. You know, if you want more daylilies, but there's lots of other things too. Plants I would be more excited about, like mountain mint. It's a beautiful landscape plant and pollinator forage, and makes a lovely mint tea. And it, you know, rhizomes all over the place, and you cut off a piece of rhizome, bring it somewhere else, and it's a new plant. And then nursery stock is like a fully established plant in a pot, or bare root, or in the case of really big stuff, bulb and burlap. If you are selecting nursery stock to plant, I generally recommend planting the smallest version available, or maybe the second smallest version available. This is much more cost effective. So a very small nursery plant might cost, you know, $7 to $20, versus the really big ones cost hundreds or even thousands of dollars. So cost is a big factor. Ease of planting. You plant something in a 1 gallon pot, it takes about 5 minutes to do a good job, versus a couple hours to plant something that's really big. And small stuff establishes much faster. So within 3 years, a small plant that costs, you know, 20 or 30 bucks is going to catch up to a big tree that costs 300. And the reason for that is a small plant has a decent root to shoot ratio. It's only this big, so it only needs this much roots, and it doesn't suffer too much from transplant shock. So it starts growing as soon as it goes in the ground. A big tree has this much roots, but it really needed this much roots. So it's just going to sit there and grow some new roots and have significant transplant shock for potentially years before it grows significantly again, by which time the little tree has caught up with it. So smaller nursery stock, cheaper, easier, less environmental impact, and is going to catch up rather quickly anyway. Yes.
Would you like to say something about if you're buying ornamental nursery stock, avoiding?
I would. I would love to say something about that. So if you're buying nursery stock, I highly recommend going to a small producer like myself, or one of many other small nurseries around Maine, because almost no small nursery uses something called neonicotinoid or systematic pesticides. These pesticides are often applied even to the seeds that are grown, and they make the entire plant toxic. This is extremely effective as a pesticide, but it also means that bees visiting the flowers of that plant, even weeks or months after the pesticide was applied, can be poisoned. And most of these chemicals are getting phased out, but there's still a lot of them around, especially in nursery stock that comes from like big box stores, and even some of the larger nurseries that are otherwise pretty decent, like Skillins or O'Donnell's. They buy in plants from all over the place and don't even know what, how those plants were initially produced. So small producers almost never use these chemicals, and you can, ask, were these produced using neonicotinoids? A lot of times at like Home Depot or something, it'll actually just say on it, like, this produced using systematic pesticides. I really think those pesticides are hopefully on their way out, but should absolutely be banned. They're just too toxic to the environment, and we really don't need them. any plant, especially ornamental plants, which is most of what these are used on, that can't exist without totally poisoning the environment around it, just shouldn't exist. So thank you for bringing up that issue. I'm not even sure why this picture is in the slide deck. And what it is the picture of a grafted plant called a Chebeague. But I'm not sure what it was there for. All right, mulch. Mulch is one of the most important techniques for a low maintenance garden. Hopefully you're already familiar with mulch in general, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. It holds soil moisture and minimizes the need for irrigation. So if you've got a significant layer of organic material on the surface of the soil, you're losing much less soil moisture to evaporation. If there are plants growing in that soil, they're losing moisture through their leaves. So moisture is still coming out, but it minimizes unnecessary loss. And that's a huge aspect of it. It moderates soil temperature. So if your soil is bare and it's a hot sunny day, that soil surface can get like 100 degrees. And that's really damaging to the soil biology. It's bad for the plants. It loses a lot of extra water, where if you got a nice blanket of leaves on there, it'll keep it nice and cool. On the flip side, at the end of the season, or I guess mostly at the end of the season, it'll keep the soil warm when nighttime temperatures get cold. The opposite of that is if you've got a heavily mulched bed right now, it might still be frozen under there because the warming radiation of the sun isn't getting to the soil. So if you're, anxious to get your peas in April, you might want to just rake off some of the mulch and just pile it on the side of the bed and let that soil warm up first thing in the spring. Protects soil biology from UV light. Yep.
Low tunnels.
What's that?
Low tunnels to warm the soil.
Yes, certainly an option, not generally necessary, but if you want to get a jump on the season, you can absolutely use low tunnels, which are plastic or row cover over a wire or other metal hoop that can create a friendly microclimate. Mulch prevents soil compaction. I mentioned earlier, you don't want to walk on your garden beds because it smashes all the air out of it. Rain also causes compaction. So if you've got bare soil, just the action of a million little raindrops hammering down on it can actually cause significant compaction. And if you have mulch, it minimizes or eliminates that. This is probably the most important one for me. Minimizes weed growth. This is especially with a heavy mulch. And when I talk about a heavy mulch, I'm talking about 6 inches of leaves will basically eliminate weeds. Sometimes people, just put on a really light layer of mulch, and that can actually cause a ton of weeds if there's weed seeds in the mulch. So if you want a really weedy garden, just put a dusting of hay on there. This much hay will give you an absolute mountain of weeds. 6 inches of hay will completely eliminate weeds, or nearly eliminate weeds. Yes.
With mulch and street grindings and stuff.
Yep.
Invasive plants that are grown into, is that really an issue? Should we try and start piles of?
Yeah, I mean, it's a possibility. I have taken whatever wood chips people randomly want to drop off by the side of my driveway for a decade or more, and I have never gotten in. Yeah, I've never gotten any invasive plants growing out of it. It's certainly possible, but It's never happened to me. I think it's worth the risk. And if you spread out some wood chips that came from the dump or whatever, and something is popping up out of it, that's a bummer. Sheet mulch it right away and should be fine.
Your experienced gardener once recommended that she said she uses compost for mulch. Do you recommend that or not?
I mean, that could be a huge benefit. It's got tons of biology in it, tons of nutrients. You will certainly gain a lot of benefits from it, but compost is a friendly environment for weed seeds to grow, and it's hygroscopic, meaning water moves through it rapidly. So I would not. Adding a layer of compost underneath your mulch is great, but I don't think it is a great mulch layer because it doesn't do some of the things that I would want mulch to do.
Some of the nurseries, the larger nurseries, are that sell mulch, have something now which is a combination of, I forget what you call it. What?
Nutrimulch, they call it.
Nutrimulch, yeah.
Like
Isn't
50-50.
that got compost in it?
50-50.
Yeah,
Is that?
I'm neutral on that.
Yeah,
I'll
that's what I
I'll
wondered.
talk a bit more about like different types of mulch and what I recommend. Yeah.
Huge amounts, and I just wondered what happens there. Weeds. Okay.
Yeah, I'll talk about that in just a second. And then this is also an important point. It feeds soil biology, and in doing so adds nutrients and carbon to the soil. So mulch is basically any dead plant material that you're putting on the surface of the soil. All that stuff is going to break down over time and essentially turn into compost. Which is why most of my gardens, when I established them 15, 16 years ago, put on a thick layer of compost, did that sheet mulching technique. Some areas I've re-sheet mulched multiple times because they got really weedy and I didn't want to hand weed it. So I've re-sheet mulched some areas several times, but mostly my maintenance is light weeding and heavy mulching with tree leaves in the fall. And that soil is just getting better and better and better just from that leaf mulch composting over time. I do not. Too much work. That said, whole leaves tend to blow away sometimes. So if you are like putting leaves on your garden and then it's a blustery fall day and they blow away, what I recommend is putting something else on top of them to keep them in place. So a very light layer of wood chips is good. Seaweed that you collect at the beach is awesome because it also provides a bunch of micronutrients. Worst case scenario, some like sticks or whatever garden debris is around, just to hold it down long enough that the mycelium in the soil can kind of grab onto it, and that will help it stay in place. Also, I don't tend to have that problem because basically all the leaves that I use for mulch come from landscapers who dump them in my yard, and the machines that they use to collect the leaves tend to break them up at least a little bit, and then they don't blow around so much. So the costs of mulch are, you have to get it no matter what it is. That could mean raking it off of areas where you don't want leaves to accumulate, or going to your neighbors and picking up their bagged leaves, or purchased, and then you got to put out the mulch. It's not completely free. It can provide habitat for some pests or diseases. So if you had a significant outbreak of some pest or disease, you might want to remove that mulch and do something with it. That could mean just moving it to the other side of the yard. It could mean, in an extreme case, burning it. But, I almost never have to do that, but it's good to mention that, that, let's say you had brown rot in a cherry tree, you might want to rake up the leaves underneath that tree at the end of the season to reduce the chance of it happening again next year. You talked about it slows the warming of soil in spring and doesn't mix well with free-range chickens. Mulch provides excellent habitat for all sorts of insects, and the chickens like to scratch it up and eat those bugs, which is not the worst. You can just put the mulch back, but I find it to be annoying, which is why my chickens are now confined. My personal favorite mulch, tree leaves. We are surrounded by trees here in Maine. We have more tree cover than any other state, and consequently have lots of tree leaves around. They are more nutritious than most other mulches. They're almost always free. They're abundant. There's basically no downside. One potential downside is if the trees that made the leaves were growing on heavily lead contaminated soil, they will bioaccumulate some lead. So ideally don't get your tree leaves from the peninsula in Portland. Other than that, pretty much anywhere you're fine. Where I talked about stuff you can do to prevent them from blowing away. It's either hay or straw, probably straw. Straw is the leftover stems from grain production. It's more expensive than most other mulches I recommend, but not that expensive. It's like 10 or 12 bucks a bale. You can actually get quite a bit out of it. And its weed pressure is very low. So it can be a very convenient and relatively inexpensive mulch. Hay also, it's about a third the cost of straw, but has tons of weed seeds in it. Not necessarily a deal breaker, you just have to put it on really heavy. And I would let it get wet and sit around for a while first. If you have a bale of hay that's been out in the weather for a few weeks, it'll just turn green with all the weed seeds germinating in it. Then you can spread it out and all those weed seeds will have died because all their roots and stuff will be exposed and they'll just dry out.
How thick do you need to put that down? You were saying
About 6 inches if it's like fluffy, or about 2 inches if it's like, if you've left it out and it's gotten like kind of gross and slimy, it'll flake off, and you can just lay those out like tiles, and those only need to be about 1 inch thick. Wood chips, sometimes available for free at like transfer stations, or if you hang a sign on the end of your driveway that says wood chips wanted, people will randomly drop them off for you. There's also a website called Chip Drop that I have not had great success with, but I know lots of people who have, especially if you tip the driver. You can often get wood chip dumps from road crews and stuff like that. It's excellent. Mulch material lasts quite a while compared to other mulches. Really stimulates fungal growth in the soil, which is wonderful for perennials and woody plants. Maybe too much fungal growth for a vegetable garden. So I usually recommend wood chips for, it's great for a path in a vegetable garden, but I wouldn't necessarily mulch all my vegetables with wood chips. I would prefer tree leaves for that. And then here's the mulch that I wouldn't recommend. The orange or black dyed wood mulch that they sell at Skillins and O'Donnell's and all that. Aesthetically, a lot of people like it. I can appreciate the aesthetics, but you don't really know where the wood is coming from. There's the chance of wood from demolition waste being mixed in there. And the dyes are not terrible, but they're not great either. And it's also a very low quality food for soil essentially, because it's mostly heartwood. It's not like chipped brush, it's like chipped wood. So it has a lot less nutritional value for the soil than natural wood chips. So if you can just adjust your aesthetic desire from this to this, which might be a big ask, I think you'll be better off, and certainly economically. This is free. This is like $60 a yard. Yeah, if you really want dyed wood mulch, you gotta have it. There is a arborist company on what is that, Riverside Street in Portland, that does make it on site with chipped tree waste. So at least in that case, you're still getting a dye that is a dye, but you know that it's not demolition waste or anything particularly gross. It's just chipped up trees with dye in it.
I asked what they used for that, and not at that place, but another place, and they said they used charcoal. So I said, well, this must be.
Yeah, if it's charcoal, then that's much better. A lot of it's made with something called carbon black, which is essentially charcoal, but it's basically more like industrial soot, which is much less nice than charcoal. So yeah, hopefully it's coming from like a wood gasification power plant. That's sort of like the ideal for dyed mulch. And if that's what it is, then great. Then you know your dye is something that's very safe. Yes.
In the name of changing your aesthetics, there's also like native ground covers.
Yes.
To an even better job.
Yes, absolutely. I will talk about that too.
A little bit of sleep in there, covered in no time.
All right, compost. No matter what the problem with your soil is, the answer is probably compost. Sometimes you might run into a very specific micronutrient deficiency or something like that, but 99 times out of 100, if there's something wrong, compost is the place to turn. The reason for that is compost has tons of organic material. Building organic material in the soil solves a myriad of problems, including water. For every 1% of organic material that you can build in the soil, you increase the soil's ability to hold water by 1 inch of rain. So a 1 inch of rain, that's like a serious rainstorm. And you can store that in 1% of soil carbon. So pre-colonization, a lot of our soils were 20 to 30% carbon. So it's like an incredible sponge. Now, most soils are like 2 to 3%. And if your garden soil gets up like 7 to 10, you're in really good shape. So at 10% soil carbon, you can basically soak up a flood.
What ash should your compost pile? What ash should be used or should you not use?
A little bit of wood ash is nice, because basically what you're getting with wood ash is all the minerals that were in a whole tree. So those minerals are nice, but who knows what you get when you mix wood ash and water. Lye is pretty caustic, so it tends to be bad for your soil biology. So a little bit is fine because it'll get buffered out by all the carbon in the pile, but I wouldn't dump like a bucket. So like a cup of wood ash sprinkled in your pile, probably fine. A bucket spread over, a quarter acre or something, great. But dense applications of wood ash or lots of wood ash over time tend to be not beneficial. So compost. It's full of organic material. That's wonderful. It's full of nutrients. Also wonderful. Potentially the most important thing you're getting from compost is a infusion of soil biology. With that in mind, you want to source compost that is alive. So ideally not coming to you in a plastic bag. If you think of like what that soil biology needs to live, if it's sealed in a plastic bag and stored in a warehouse for a while, most of it's going to die. So if you can buy compost locally, I recommend Wilshore Farm. It's about 10 minutes from here on Hurricane Road in Falmouth. Contact information's in the handout. Bulk locally produced compost is a better product and much, much, much cheaper than any bagged product. You can also make compost at home. This right here is probably the worst possible way to make compost. I've seen about 100 of these, and maybe one of them was functioning properly. Yeah, terrible.
It's like a garbage can.
And people tend to just take these and just dump kitchen waste in them, and just kitchen waste does not make compost. This is a much better system. This one's maybe a bit small. Really, to have an effective compost pile, it should be minimum 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. I personally usually make bins out of pallets because they're convenient and free, but a big circle of fairly small diameter wire also works fine. And the biggest thing is you need a mix of carbon, nitrogen, water, and air for things to compost. Carbon, sometimes called browns, is dead plant material. So that could be fallen tree leaves, pulled weeds that have, dried out and desiccated, sawdust, wood chips, all that stuff has lots of carbon in it. Nitrogen could be animal manures, or even human manure, urine. Food scraps are an excellent source of nitrogen. Seaweed, also pretty decent nitrogen source. And air is very important. Having bulky carbon material usually traps enough air in the pile that's fine. For most people, it's called a static pile, i.e. a compost pile you're not turning, is by far the simplest way to make compost. And so what I recommend is if you want to make your own compost, which is a great way to dispose of lots of organic waste that comes from your household or garden, and generate this nice finished compost. What I do is set up a bin system. It should be, like I said, about 3 feet cubed minimum. And it should be something that household pets will not get into. You do not want your dog to eat out of your compost pile, ideally. And then whenever a nitrogen component goes in, which is usually going to be like a bucket of kitchen waste, which will probably be sloppy and kind of gross and whatever, that goes in and you immediately cover it with some sort of carbon cover material. That keeps flies out, it keeps the compost from smelling bad, and it's a simple way to always have this mix of carbon, nitrogen, air, and water, and you're not going to get like super fast composting or like perfect compost conditions, but you should do pretty all right, and that's good enough for most people, and it'll never wind up being a massive pile of disgusting sludge. Like you would get if you just put kitchen waste only into this thing. All right, we are rapidly running out of time. So I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit for the last half hour. For watering systems, real small scale, watering can, way to go. This is my absolute favorite hose end And what it is a garden hose ball valve and a rose cone. This whole setup costs about 12 bucks. And the reason I like it so much is it's extremely convenient. You can turn on, you can put out a lot of water really fast. It's always really gentle on the soil. You're not going to wind up digging up your seedlings with a spray of water. But because you've got this control at the end of the hose where you're working, it makes it really easy to leave it to drip. So you can, without going back to the faucet or whatever, you can set it to drip. So if you've got, you know, a tree that you planted and you want to just like slowly, deeply water it for 20 minutes, you can turn this ball valve on, just do a trickle and leave it for half an hour and come back. A sprinkler with an integrated timer can be really nice. You would not believe how many times I've left a sprinkler on for way longer than I meant to, because I was like, oh, I'm not going to just sit here and watch it for 20 minutes. I got stuff to do. If you set your timer for 20 minutes, it'll just automatically turn off and you don't have to remember to come back. On a larger scale, especially for annual vegetable production, drip tape is really nice. It's a lot of semi-disposable plastic, which is kind of a bummer. But it is very gentle on water use, because rather than spraying water all over the place, it puts the water directly onto the soil right next to the plant that you're watering. It's also got a bit more of a setup cost than a $12 hose end or a $30 sprinkler. You're looking at about 150 bucks to get started with drip tape. But it's very effective, and if you coil it up at the end of the season, you can get several seasons out of the tape. Harvest and preservation. Once you get going with gardens, you'll wind up with more than you know what to do with, hopefully. Just a few tips I like to pass on to people. These are vacuum packed frozen fruit. And if you are freezing fruit or vegetables, you can look up what they need, but usually for fruits, what I do is I cut them up and freeze them on a cookie sheet. And then once they're totally frozen, I'll vacuum pack them and freeze them. This almost entirely prevents freezer burn. So especially if you have like a deep freeze, fruit will stay good for several years in this condition, compared to if it's in a Ziploc bag, it usually, degrades significantly after being frozen for a while. A dehydrator is another real handy thing if you have excess garden produce. These are all sorts of different dried fruits that we've made. I've also recently acquired a freeze dryer, which is an expensive piece of infrastructure, but creates absolutely amazing freeze-dried garden produce. Canning and pickling are useful skills to cultivate if you've got extra materials. A root cellar is an amazing way to store stuff. I still have last year's potatoes in perfect condition in my root cellar, what's left of them. And if you have an unheated basement, you can section off a corner of it, especially if it's got like a window in it that you can let cold air in occasionally. Other ways to have the root cellar-like environments are burying a barrel or a broken freezer in the ground. And then that gives you access to, long-term cold storage over the winter. There are lots of technological things you can do, like have a thermostat with a light bulb in there, so that right before it freezes, it'll just click on a light bulb for a minute to bring it up above freezing. But my root cellar is totally passive. The only thing I do is open the door when in the fall. I'll open the door every night for like a week to get the cold air into the root cellar, get the temperature down to like 33, and then it stays between 33 and 37 until about now. When it's like now it's up to like 38, 39. That is my last slide. And I think there might be, oh, one more thing I wanted to talk about that I don't have a slide for is cover crops. And cover crops are plants that you grow not to harvest the plant itself, but to either feed soil, suppress weeds, or some combination thereof. So cover crops can have many different purposes. So for instance, you might grow field peas as a cover crop to put nitrogen into the soil. The peas will feed sugar from photosynthesis to rhizobium bacteria that live in the roots of the peas that are able to pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere and fix it into a plant available form. And then you can cut down those field peas and they become a high nitrogen compost, essentially, right on the soil surface. You can grow cover crops to enhance soil carbon. And all cover crops, while doing those processes, are also feeding sugar directly to the biology in the soil. So they're really improving and maintaining those soil communities while you're not growing crops on that spot or not, ready to plant a garden on that spot. You can also use cover crops to suppress weeds. So if you've got an area that is, has a lot of weed seeds in the soil, you could grow a cover crop like buckwheat, where it's very aggressive, has large leaves, and it smothers out weeds. And then as long as you cut the buckwheat down and leave it on the soil surface as a mulch layer before it sets viable seed, you can really clear up a large area using the biological process of cover crops. You can also use cover crops as something called biotillage. If you have light to moderate compaction in your soil, you can use a cover crop or cover crop mix that has forage radishes or daikons in it, and you'll get a whole bunch of giant roots growing into the soil, breaking up the compaction, and you just leave them there over the winter. The winter kills them, and then you get this like core of pure organic material that really opens up the soil from compaction. There's also something called a permanent cover crop, which is often white clover or some other very low growing material where you've got the soil completely covered with low growing plants and then larger plants like a tomato or whatever growing up out of that. So instead of having dead plants as mulch, you have a complete mat of living plants that protects the soil, feeds the soil, prevents weed intrusion, and the other plants kind of just grow through it. A mix of different cover crop species is always going to be preferable to a single species cover crop. Peas, vetch, and oats is a really common soil building cover crop. But whenever you're planting cover crops, you want to make sure that you know how you're going to get rid of them, lest you plant, let's say, winter rye, and then suddenly that's like all you've got because you didn't plan for how to get rid of it. So winter killed cover crops are usually your easiest ones. So that's like oats, peas, forage radish, buckwheat. All of those, the winter's just going to kill them, and that area will be ready to plant in the spring. One more thing, which is the landscape equivalent of cover crops could be ground covers. So there's lots of low growing plants that can be used in place of mulch in landscape rather than in like vegetable gardens. And that does the same thing. It protects the soil, builds soil, feeds those soil microorganisms, but it also can be a very important aspect of habitat. So it creates food for pollinating insects and habitat for insects and all that at the same time. All right, I think that's pretty much what I have for you. And if anybody's got questions, I'm happy to answer questions.
I just wanted to ask you about our reach garden.
Uh-huh.
Many of us use that because we can't, we don't have what about that?
I think it's a good service.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I mean,
no.
It's become, I mean, it's got a tremendous business now. I think it's wonderful, but it's okay, that compost.
Yeah.
Really notice when we get the bags of it, now over the winter, I have to break them all out before.
Yeah, I don't think it's like the most top quality primo compost, but it's pretty good. And yeah, no, they definitely are. They're adding a carbon source for sure. And I haven't seen one recently, but last I checked, they were in like a woven bag.
Yes, I know.
And that's exactly to allow it to breathe, stay alive, rather than if it was sealed in a plastic film bag that would like smother all the living stuff in it.
Return it to them, so they can reuse it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think overall it's a good service.
Yeah.
On your seedlings.
Yes, and I thank you for mentioning that. I sent this handout for printing like a couple days ago, and then this morning I looked at it and I was like, oh, Raspar's is out of business. I don't recommend this anymore. I made a few edits. So the digital version is, which I should go back to, the digital version has a few updates, pretty minor. The only other one that I'll mention is in the handout that you got, if you got a paper one, it mentions getting compost from the Yarmouth wastewater treatment plant, which unfortunately I no longer recommend because of PFAS. So yes.
So, I like the buckwheat thing. Is the buckwheat thing? We have a relatively small garden, but it's, but could we grow buckwheat on top of that? And should we cut down at a certain point?
Yes.
And before it comes to go crazy seed wise.
Exactly.
Okay. So like before, normally you would harvest those seeds with machines later on. So it's actually quite a bit earlier than that.
Yeah.
And then you leave that there all lie down.
Yep.
Awesome. And then the next year, that year, maybe.
Yep. Yeah, you could plant a quick crop after buckwheat, but it's going to take most of the season to really smother everything out. And the kind of ideal time to cut most cover crops is once the seeds have set, but before they're viable. And that's a key point because a lot of annuals, and most cover crops are annuals, there's a switch in their genetics that once they've set seed, they're like, okay, I have reproduced and it's time for me to die. You cut them down at that point and they're gone. If you were to cut down that plant earlier, let's say, it's early July and you're like, hey, if I cut this now, I can plant, whatever crop and get it done before the end of the season. That plant is like, oh, I was eaten by a deer and I better get grown again. So there is that key point. There are lots of ways that you can kill cover crops sort of in addition to that. So there's winter, there's cutting it like when it's set seed, but the seed's not ripe yet. There's also solarization, which means you cut it down and cover it with a clear piece of plastic. And that, you know, impact of cutting plus the stress of like, oh, it's now 130 degrees under this piece of plastic, that can also kill it.
Okay.
And you leave it there for like a couple sunny days and pull it off, and that'll usually kill
So
off
you've
the
got
cover
an
crop.
existing grassy area, I use the term grass loosely in our house. Do I want to kill that layer of grass first with the plastic and stuff, or you kind of go right on top of it with something and cover the cardboard?
Yeah, you can go right over grass with cardboard for sure. You probably couldn't, like, you couldn't overseed a lawn, even a crappy lawn, with buckwheat and expect it to
Oh,
smother out.
no, I do what.
Yeah.
I need somebody else because we have 43 feet of clay.
Yeah.
Oh, then this one's got some.
Yeah. Question back. Yes, pine needles are tree leaves and can be used as such. I actually really like pine needles more than broadleaf for a lot of things. They don't blow away, they don't get matted. So if I am seeding a nursery bed, let's say with chestnuts or something, if I put a heavy mulch of tree leaves on there, the little chestnut shoots won't come up, but I can put a sprinkle of pine needles on there, get most of the benefits of mulch, and still have a light enough mulch that stuff can come up through it.
Grass, did you talk about grass as mulch, cut grass?
I didn't. Grass is an okay mulch. It's really high in water and nitrogen, like fresh grass clippings. So it can be okay, but if you put it on heavy, it gets really hot and can kind of cook plants, or it like gets weird, like doesn't really compost, it kind of rots in a weird way. So mostly I recommend just mulching grass clippings back into the area that's being mowed. Or if you do want to remove them for whatever reason, they're a great nitrogen source for a compost pile, but they're not a great mulch.
Age, they'll get probably fine.
Yeah. Yeah, but like if you just mow grass and then dump it all in a pile, it doesn't compost. It turns into like a weird black sludge. Yeah. So you got to mix it with other stuff. Any other questions?
Can I ask another question?
Yeah, go for it.
So I'm having a little disagreement with my husband and son-in-law. It's like, I just really want to do completely no-till, and we do that in some areas. And my son-in-law says he likes to till because it kills off the slugs.
Yeah.
But I didn't know your thoughts on till and no-till.
Yeah, I mean, I try to minimize, well, I basically can't till unless it's really superficial because I live in a sand pit, and if I tilled it, all my soil would sink into 100 feet of sand. But when people I know have run into issues with no-till, it's almost always a buildup of some pest. Like the no-till bed becomes a beautiful habitat for something. So if you've got a ton of slugs, that might be a reason to till once in a while. You might also be able to use other methods to control the slug population. Like once stuff's established, if you can run ducks or chickens through there, they'll eat them.
Just got 2 ducks. Would you say the leaf mulch would encourage?
It's pretty good slug habitat. I don't have, like, I have slugs around. They're usually not very detrimental. But you can also like sprinkle wood ash or diatomaceous earth on the surface of the mulch, and that really deters slugs pretty effectively. You just have to keep doing it whenever it rains.
Don't handle with diatomaceous earth with your hands.
And definitely don't breathe the diatomaceous earth.
Make some low growing ground covers that
Yes, like a landscaping. I really like self-heal or Prunella vulgaris. Violets are really nice. Yeah, geraniums. Yes, yeah, a true geranium. I'm running a blank right now, but if you go to the Wild Seed Project, their website has some lists. Like there's a section for plant lists, and one of them is native ground covers, and there's lots of nice options. Although their idea of what ground cover, like how tall a ground cover could be, is generous, let's say. But there's several good ones in there. Yarrow is another nice one. Bluets. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for coming.